Hi, Dr. Lloyd. It's great to see you again. Could you please introduce yourself to us?
Thank you. Good to see you, Dr. Losier. I'm Vincent Lloyd. I teach at Villanova University in the Theology and Religious Studies department and the Center for Political Theology here. And I've been interested in Black religion and prisons for the last couple of decades. Dr. Losier, could you say a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am an associate professor here at the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst. I also direct the Social Thought and Political Economy program, which is sort of an interdisciplinary social science program, undergraduate major here at UMass. And in a way have been principally interested in questions of prisoner organizing, prisoner rights, and really the kind of broad history of the prison movement in the United States. And just to kind of get us started, to get right into things, I wanted to just start off by asking you really how incarceration has been infused with religious ideas and practices from the very beginning. Can you give us some early historical background on religion and prisons in the United States?
Thanks. Yes. So first, I think it's important to remember that the prison hasn't always existed. It's a relatively recent, in the big scheme of history, relatively recent innovation, relatively recent way in which we think about punishment in the United States. It was in the early 19th century that we get the first prison construction on a large scale and first sort of reflection on what a prison can be. And when that happens in a couple of different places, in Pennsylvania and New York, the language in which it's articulated, the language in which the purpose of the prison is articulated is a Christian language, one that's talking about penitence, from the root of penitentiary, is thinking about redemptive suffering. When we look at the one of the main models for the early prison, the so-called Pennsylvania model here in the Philadelphia area, Eastern State Pennsylvania Eastern State Penitentiary was the exemplar of this model. The Quaker values of Pennsylvania were infusing how that prison was constructed in terms of individuals being alone all day in solitary confinement, reflecting on what they were incarcerated for, the reasons for their incarceration. And the thought was that a kind of inner light could shine through and transform those individuals in their solitude in the more Puritan-infused New York prison system, exemplified by the Auburn model. There's a sense of collective work, right? If all day those incarcerated were working together to manufacture goods, to be productive citizens, they could in that way, and through the kind of physical suffering that work and the punishments involved in that prison system involved, become better people. So from those earliest days in the 19th century, this whole idea of responding to harms in our society by keeping people in cages was one that was growing out of a particularly Christian way of thinking about the world and way of thinking about individual guilt, suffering, and redemption. I wonder, Dr. Losier, mentioned how our whole system of incarceration has religion at its origins, but could you say a bit about individuals who are trying to live out their faith while incarcerated, and maybe the early history of religious liberty advocacy by incarcerated people?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question. There's ways in which the sort of like Protestant origins of the modern penitentiary, as you were sort of just speaking to it, have been very much kind of shaped the sort of outset of the institution. And that led to not only kind of helping to frame the way in which the institution was organized and operated, and its kind of like kind of initial sort of ethos, it's like the DNA of it to some degree, but it also had an impact in terms of how non-Protestant religious practitioners were impacted by this sort of like kind of founding origins of the institution. And one of the, I think, key dynamics to keep in mind is that really until the era of the like 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the most folks incarcerated in the United States were incarcerated in state institutions, which is still the case today. And the kind of core legal principle related to those institutions was that incarcerated individuals were considered essentially slaves of the state, which meant that their civil rights, the sort of constitutional claims that they could make with, to varying degrees in public life, were not available to them while they were behind bars. And so this led to dynamics of kind of overt religious discrimination against folks who were whose religion kind of contravened the sort of standards of like Protestant religious practices. So you have different instances where folks who were Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, or atheists, sometimes even also as well like Seventh-day Adventists and what have you, because of their being members of disfavored religious groups in relationship to these kind of Protestant origins, found it really faced a variety of different burdens in terms of being able to practice their faith. One of the things that I think is also important to keep in mind is that this would become more of an issue as larger numbers of these folks would be incarcerated, and we sort of start to see some ways in which some of the early kind of origins of efforts to demand access to kind of a greater expansion of religious rights and sort of chipping away at this sort of hands-off approach begins to happen a bit during the 1940s. We see some early religious advocacy on the part of leaders of the Nation of Islam who are, there's sort of a critical mass of them who are arrested for draft evasion during the course of World War II. And it's notable that these individuals are held in federal prison as opposed to state prison. And federal prison officials are more willing to negotiate with them and to find ways to at least make some accommodations in terms of their religious practices. So Elijah Muhammad, who was a kind of founding leader of the Nation of Islam in the Depression era, when he's incarcerated along with several of his sort of like top lieutenants in federal penitentiary, the warden is willing to allow them to erect basically shacks in the prison yard to give them space to conduct their religious services. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have an imam or some other kind of outside religious figure come and kind of minister to them on a regular basis, but they're at least given some degree of space through a kind of like informal negotiation with prison officials to be able to practice their religion. This kind of early dynamic is something that will kind of be more of an aberration than the norm as increasing numbers of, kind of members of the Nation of Islam in particular are incarcerated, and we'll see sort of a shift away from these kind of, this sort of practice over the decades to come in the 50s and the 60s and what have you.
Yes, as you're talking, it makes me think of the ambivalent role of the prison chaplain throughout the history of the prison, even in the early days. On the one hand, the prison chaplain is sometimes portrayed and remembered as someone who's moderating influence in the excesses of the brutality of the prison in the 19th century. at the same time, the prison chaplain, as an employee of the prison system, is always compromised in those ostensibly reformist goals that he or later she may involve in that. The presence of an outside religious representative who is at the same time a functionary of the prison system or of the end of the state in that sense seems like a point of contest throughout the history of religious liberty in prisons, and the kind of independent organizing of incarcerated people that you're referring to has an interesting relationship to that role of the prison chaplain. I wonder, moving forward from these early days, when we start to see calls for religious freedom in prisons gain more traction.
Yeah, it's actually worth noting that it's during the sort of like 1950s, but specifically like 1960s era, that this really starts to shift. And we could say sort of like a confluence of two different developments. One is the sort of increasingly liberal court rulings by the Warren Court. There's a number of different kind of personal rights, civil rights rulings that are key to the Warren Court, and one of them has to do with the broadening of religious rights during this period. The other is particularly in states outside of the South. So we're talking about particularly key states like New York, California, and Illinois, amidst the sort of like second wave of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South, particularly the Deep South, that we see an increasing kind of shift in the racial demographics of prison in key institutions in those states, and states that are receiving migrants, as well as, and kind of one of the sort of most significant dynamics is this increased advocacy by converts to the Nation of Islam. Some folks would come into prison having been, already adherents to the Nation of Islam, and then a kind of another important layer of individuals who convert to the Nation of Islam while they're in prison. And one of the things that I think is worth noting that sort of helps to make the Nation of Islam a kind of key organization for pushing forward this expansion of religious freedoms behind bars is it kind of in contrast to sort of what you were just speaking about in terms of the sort of ambivalent role of the prison chaplain. The Nation of Islam has both particular demands that it's making around questions of religious liberty. So there's basic questions of access to the Quran, and then also for a number of converts, they're seeking to get access to columns written by Elijah Muhammad, particularly in the Pittsburgh Courier, which is a key African-American newspaper during this period of time. So that's one thing. And then there's also demands around pork-free meals. Kind of dietary restrictions. And then also questions of access, ideally access to ministers in the Nation of Islam. And so this is kind of broadening the scope of who's playing the role of the kind of like the classical prison chaplain, that sort of thing. And if folks are familiar with an individual like, say, Malcolm X, that was somebody who was kind of part of an earlier period of converts to the Nation of Islam. And at the very least, if we look at, say, Malcolm X's case, while he was incarcerated in prison, he was part of a small group of converts who petitioned to be able to get cells kind of facing east so they could conduct their prayers, right? The way their demands within the institution, rather than being negotiated, are seen as sort of early security threats by prison administrators. They're forced to look outside of prisons for some degree of relief. And increasingly, this becomes demands for relief within the federal courts. So you get a series of court cases in California, Pierce versus Lavalle, in New York State, Sostre versus McGinnis, and then in Illinois, Cooper versus Pate. So alongside these key cases, you get just sort of a raft of prisoner litigation that's taking place. And scholars are still trying to figure this out. There's some suspicion that at least prisoners in different states are at least following cases that are taking place in other parts of the nation. Within the same institution, they're prisoners, many of whom, only had up to a high school education or less than that, are learning from each other in terms of how to properly file, federal federal court petitions and things of that nature. These cases are effectively chipping away at the sort of what was, prior to this moment, a kind of longstanding hands-off doctrine, and then this sort of slaves of the state idea that really prisoners had no claims that they could make. And it's in the Cooper versus Pate, the 1964 Cooper versus Pate ruling. Cooper, who is a migrant to Chicago, kind of listed as a Roman Catholic when he comes into the institution, and someone who was marked as a kind of an agitator behind bars, and a key convert to the Nation of Islam. At a moment when the Nation of Islam was essentially considered a gang by prison officials, is brought before the warden and is sort of talking to him about both the kinds of demands that he's making as a member of this sort of like still kind of seen as an unauthorized religious organization, at least behind bars, and also trying to sort of prove his mettle by sort of making kind of references to kind of obscure aspects of the Nation of Islam, then gets involved in kind of pursuing litigation, essentially because by Cooper's account, the warden tells him, like, look, I'm not going to, as long as you're not conforming to the rules of the institution, I'm not going to, you're going to stay in segregation for the remainder of your time in the facility. And if you want to seek any relief, you might as well like write to the courts or something to that effect. And by Cooper's account, it's that sort of like suggestion that launches him on this trajectory of pursuing and kind of, writing out these sort of handwritten legal briefs and what have you, without any kind of tutelage perspective, per se. It's possible that these were instances where you have prisoners who are, through potentially like their family members, getting access to court rulings that are taking place in other states. And it's in the Cooper versus Pate, the 1964 Cooper versus Pate ruling, that we see the U.S. Supreme Court kind of reversing prior federal court precedent and saying that these are cases that should be heard, and that these are cases that should be, these sort of petitions should be considered. They shouldn't just be roundly dismissed. And ultimately, what is decided is that this is both considered a broader question of religious liberty, that kind of prison institutions shouldn't be interfering in, shouldn't be preventing individuals from being able to, access religious texts, be able to eat meals that conform with their religious beliefs and what have you. But this also broadens up the scope through which prisoners can make demands upon federal courts, even if they're held in state institutions, can make demands upon federal courts about the conditions of their confinement. And it's from this sort of kind of wave of activism by converts to the Nation of Islam, principally during the late 50s, 1960s, that also opens up a kind of raft of other opportunities for prisoners to make demands about their individual circumstances, and then increasingly around how they might be able to organize or kind of congregate collectively in prison. So there's other issues taking place at the same time, but ultimately, kind of religious liberty claims become the means by which uh, the practice of practicing being a practicing member of the Nation of Islam gets legitimized, but also these broader prisoner rights uh, demands can be enunciated, can be articulated during the kind of decades to come.
Oh, that's fascinating. Thanks, and I hear in your remarks there both reflection on the sort of ingenuity of incarcerated folks fighting against racial discrimination by means of religious liberty claims, but also from the other side, the Nation of Islam sort of coordinating in some ways religious liberty claims as a means of institution building. I mean, I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about that latter side of it. What other things was the Nation of Islam doing inside of prisons, and how did the religious liberty claim sort of fit into that larger prison-focused project that the nation was engaged in?
It's interesting in that this is a period of this era of the late 50s and early 60s is a really dynamic period of organizing and institution building by the Nation of Islam generally, like on the streets, in various different parts of the country outside of the South. Although there's a few mosques that the Nation of Islam is establishing in the South as well too. As best as we can tell, it's actually not something that's being direct. This sort of like process of agitation behind bars is not something that's necessarily being centrally organized by the Nation of Islam. There's really dynamic work that's being done by men, and this is principally something that's taking place in institutions that are holding male prisoners, men who are converts to the Nation of Islam behind bars, who are actively converting, or as they sort of refer to it, like fishing for converts in prison. And to the degree that there's some outside support that the nation is offering, it's largely taking place through providing legal representation for these religious liberty claims when they're making their way through federal court. But by sort of most accounts that scholars have been able to find, the kind of efforts to both challenge different practices behind bars, and this runs a gamut from, as I said earlier, kind of challenging discrimination in terms of who gets access to kind of remedial education classes, who gets access to preferred job opportunities behind bars, and like fights with prison guards. All this is being organized by these converts behind bars.
Makes me think about as you're nicely putting, the way that sort of religious forms and practices spread outside of from a kind of bottom up way, or sort of horizontal way rather than a top down way. And my colleague Josh Sugar and I looked a little bit at this Muslim Brotherhood case from the early 60s, where this phrase Muslim Brotherhood is not referring to the organization that we now know in Egypt or elsewhere, but seems to sort of be arising organically out of responding to the particular conditions and needs of the incarcerated folks in their context, and demanding Qurans and demanding the knowledge about history of Islamic peoples and Arabic language, but also, all these demands sort of arising seemingly not out of a deep institutional context, but seemingly sort of grasping for tools that seem to be working elsewhere nearby, and putting them together in a way that is actually how religions usually grow and change, right? It's not that this is not religious, right? This is actually how religion always works, right? It's taking different pieces from here and there, combining them in ways that are responding to the particularities of one's context. And that, I think, poses a challenge for courts to respond to, right? If courts want to see religion as something that has a set of beliefs that come from, that are enforced by sacred text and a set of authority figures, how does that match with the way that religion actually works, and particularly the way that religion works in the context of incarceration, where the lines between the religious and the political, what's pejoratively or punitively labeled as a gang versus a religion, get very, very blurry.
We're still, as scholars, trying to figure out kind of how some of this horizontal kind of legal efforts are taking place, but it's oftentimes done in instances where prison officials were quite opposed to what they were doing, were surveilling them, monitoring them. In Stateville Prison, which was considered the most secure facility in Illinois, where Cooper and other converts were held, you actually had one prison guard who was stationed by the pipes within the segregation wing of the facility, because as they're held in individual kind of isolation cells, these converts got good at taking the water out of the toilets and using the pipes within their cells as a means by which they can communicate from one cell to another, or sort of one tier of the prison to another, one tier of the segregation wing to another. There's sort of dynamic examples of organizing that that are emblematic of this particular instance, but then sort of lay the groundwork for kind of what we see kind of opening up kind of the broader landscape of some of these religious liberty questions. I'm curious in terms of what you think is the ways in which this resonates with other examples of religious liberty wins for incarcerated people, over the decades to come. So, what do you make of like other examples where you have particularly disfavored groups? Obviously, the Nation of Islam kind of gets legitimized during the decade that follows the Cooper versus Pate and other cases. How do you see sort of questions of religious liberty sort of play out with other organizations, particularly Black religious groups, and their efforts to challenge hostility and discrimination in prison and before the courts?
Yes, yeah, and before sort of directly addressing that, I wonder if it's useful to just step back a little bit for a moment and sort of reflect on why religious practice in prison is so important beyond ability to express the beliefs and convictions of incarcerated folks, right? If we think about the role of religion during slavery, right? What religion is creating a space for community organizing, a space for meeting each other, a space for sharing information, a space for hope, a space for beauty and music, right? The site of religious gathering, whether clandestine or authorized during slavery, right, is one of the very few places where this kind of these sort of building blocks of organizing can take place, and I think we see strong parallels of that kind of structure, that kind of importance to religious, the ability to practice religion in this in incarceration, right, where where forms of organizing, the building blocks of organizing, are actively attacked by prison leadership. There are, religious communities and religious practice provide spaces for meeting each other, building relationships, for gaining knowledge and information, for making connections outside and beyond the site of incarceration, for planning, for hope, for aesthetic practice. So, I mean, and all of this might seem unreligious or secular, but of course, religion is always a mix of the practical, the political, the imaginative, the beautiful, the spiritual, and the otherworldly. And yeah, it's the sort of appreciating that the sort of central importance of religion, in which, yeah, in some ways, the Nation of Islam in the 1960s is doing what sort of forms of Christianity in the early 19th century were doing with respect to slavery versus the prison. I mean, here in Philadelphia, to address your question more directly, of course, the MOVE organization, this group of Black folks in West Philadelphia who were committed to a natural lifestyle, who were worried about environmental catastrophe, were also committed to following what they saw as a kind of explicitly divine law, which recognized the spirituality of all things and the interconnection between people and animals and land. This group MOVE was attacked by the Philadelphia Police Department repeatedly, and eventually, famously, their compound was firebombed via helicopter in West Philadelphia, destroying a city block. Throughout the history and still today, MOVE folks have been incarcerated and have been making religious liberty claims around the kind of practices that would allow them to practice their commitments while in prison, around eating natural foods, around hygiene practices, and so on. The MOVE claims, happening a couple of decades after the Nation of Islam claims, were much less successful, and this is signaling, I think, a shift in the jurisprudence around religious liberty for those incarcerated. But that sort of template that was set by the Nation of Islam practitioners, and then litigation around taking a set of commitments that blend the religious and the political and the communal, articulating them for the courts as religious, and asking for and using that litigation as a vehicle for making big claims about the injustice of particular prison practices, but also the prison system as a whole, also in some cases the nation as a whole. I think we see that in MOVE. We see that in a range of other movements, in that period, and with declining success as time passes, and with increasing sort of skepticism, not only from the courts but from the general public, where the figure of the prisoner as someone who is necessarily insincere, that is necessarily scamming, right? Sets the figure of the prisoner in conflict with the requirements for having religious convictions that would be protected under the Constitution and federal law, if those convictions are always looked at, are never seen as having the kind of sincerity that they're required to have.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. And I think one of the things that's striking about the sort of earlier opportunities that the Nation of Islam was able to take advantage of is those occurred during a moment where, at the very least, the Supreme Court and later federal courts were less willing to weigh in on the question of like sincerity. One of the things I really appreciate about looking at the kind of guidelines and decisions offered by prison officials who had to kind of contend with the Nation of Islam um, during a period where it's making its presence felt behind bars is these prison officials are very explicit about the fact that from their perspective, um, uh, prison is an individual experience. You do your time uh, um, um, like by yourself, right? You're not supposed to be. If an institution is being run as securely as possible, each individual prisoner will be will be uh, you know doing their time as an individual rather than as a collective. And groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, as it was sort of understood as a Nation of Islam organization, um, was organized itself as a collective and was seen as a threat to prison security. In part because it was a group of Black prisoners, in part because it was prisoners who were practicing Islam, in part because it was an organization that explicitly understood itself as challenging kind of white supremacy in various different ways, but also because it was like formally a kind of like, a group, because it was a collective body. And it was because of that, it was not only sort of identified as a very early on as a kind of gang organization by prison officials, or at least described in that way. But I would also kind of hazard that it it sort of kind of throws into relief the way in which the collective practice of religion um, can easily be interpreted as a threat to prison security, because it's a collective practice. And yeah, prisons work best kind of going back to the sort of Eastern State Penitentiary Auburn model that you were sort of talking about, those sort of origins of the institution. Those were models that by and large relied on individuals. I mean, I think Eastern State Penitentiary was famous for having prisoners in like isolation for most of the day. They had like a Bible, and like that was it. And people went crazy because they didn't have any opportunity to interact with other folks. Beyond explicit religious liberty claims brought by those in prison, I'm curious what you think of the kinds of broader or kind of non-legal religious liberty claims being made to push back against incarceration. Kind of what can we learn from the sort of not just simply like the legal side of the fence, but the religious side of the fence in terms of how how we could wrestle with the dynamics of incarceration.
Yes, yeah, and I think it is a forgotten chapter in the history of the prison that in the late 60s and 1970s, there was a national conversation in the U.S. around the prison not working, the prison being sort of a site of sort of social failure, creating more problems than it solves, and the sort of a realization of the absurdity of the official purpose of the prison being to send away those who are caught doing bad things to be surrounded by other people who are doing bad things, and then imagining that they'll come out and be good people. Of course, this isn't the actual way that the prison works, but the sort of official logic was starting to ring hollow, and leading lights of that conversation about whether the prison itself was justified, whether the 150 years or so of the existence of the prison was enough to see that it was an experiment that had failed. Leading lights of that conversation were religious communities, and were speaking in religious idioms, ranging from Quakers and Mennonites, Christian or quasi-Christian groups that had for a long time been committed to nonviolence, to peace building, and we're now seeing the prison as a site, of violence rather than a way of responding to violence. To even evangelicals, the evangelical community in the U.S. Was involved in prison reform efforts for a long time, from the 70s to the present, often with a fair amount of ambivalence around how to reconcile sort of evangelical faith commitments with their efforts to improve prison conditions, but certainly were a voice in that conversation. One of the more striking examples that comes to mind for me was, there was a case in Indiana, which is a place where there are a good number of Mennonite and Christian brethren communities, these sort of progressive Christian communities committed to nonviolence, where a judge who was part of one of these communities was noticing restorative justice programs starting to pop up, and was so committed to sending a Vietnam War vet who had stolen from a neighbor to one of these restorative justice programs that he overlooked the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines in the state of Indiana, and ordered the incarcerated man released, and was eventually the case eventually went to the Indiana Supreme Court, and the judge himself was kicked off the case and was sort of sentenced to probation for not following the law. The judge expressed his commitment to restorative justice in terms of religious language. It was because of God's law, because of the divine law, that he would, he could not sentence this man to state prison, and instead had to, embrace restorative justice as a framework. I think this sort of circles back to what you were talking about earlier, Dr. Losier, in terms of the collective imagination that we find in religious communities, right? If we're not thinking in terms of solely in terms of an individual being good or bad, or being punished for an act for a particular period of time, but instead in terms of a collective that is expressed in different ways, whether it's the kingdom of God, or whether it's the possibility for a wholly different world that could be realized on earth if only there are collective just practices that are enacted. This form of imagining a new world that's authorized and undergirded by religious communities and rituals and aesthetics, in some cases, at the same time that other religious communities are not are focused on the individual. That potential for collective imagination, we see in these small instances, but also in this sort of collective organizing, is making space for a world beyond prisons.
There is an important kind of conservative shift that helps to justify and helps to kind of legitimate a sort of, a kind of lock them up and like throw away the key type of approach to kind of managing violations of the law, questions of, crime and what have you. And I think the way in which you're kind of highlighting the sort of religious dimensions of this this mood that is insistent upon the importance of punishment as a way to address the management of society is really key.
Yeah, I think there are probably broader cultural history questions around the
Sure.
whether the 60s and 70s were an aberration, both in terms of visions of freedom, and in terms of the sort of legal landscape, or whether they signaled a direction that was then reversed. And now, I mean, how to think about the 80s and 90s, with whether it's Reagan and Bush or Clinton and Gore, right? And Biden, all sort of pushing for culture that normalizes long prison terms, that pushes a sense of guilt onto individuals and populations, as a means of managing them, as a means of perpetuating racial and economic domination. And then all of that sort of flows into the legal landscape, and particularly the questions around religious liberty in prisons that we're talking about. I mean, it also makes me think a bit about, I guess we've been talking about the religious liberty side of things, but there are also establishment clause issues around religious groups that were trying to bring their sort of moral reform programs into prisons, and do that with the imprimatur of the state and the funding of the state. The establishment clause is the part of the Constitution that guarantees the separation of church and state. There have been a series of cases in which those incarcerated have challenged programs in their prisons based on the establishment clause. Some interesting litigation is, and court decisions have happened around the extent to which that is, the courts deem that acceptable, and it doesn't in the same period, because these are often evangelical organizations that are saying they're going to convert souls, right? And in this very individualistic term, and this sort of religion flattened into the relationship between individuals as good or bad in their own relationship with a higher power, if the language is going to be neutralized from Jesus in order to pass constitutional muster. Do these programs, do such programs work? Do they do they work? Do they turn? Do they depoliticize? Do they take away the kind of organizing energy that might otherwise exist in prisons? And even programs like Alcoholics Anonymous and related programs that have a sort of acknowledgement of submission to a higher power as their cornerstones. Right? How does this affect the capacity for collectively imagining, right, alternatives to the current world and its economic, political, racial, and carceral realities? I think these are sort of open questions, and ones that get litigated under the heading of whether the state is establishing religion by supporting such programs in prisons. One of the odd things that we find as the 90s move to a close and we move into the 2000s is that a coalition of organizations from across the ideological spectrum want to restore what they see as a diminished power of religious freedom, and this comes to include those who are incarcerated. So in RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and RLUPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, the U.S. Congress extends protections to religious liberty of incarcerated folks in the federal and state institutions, that moves beyond just the First Amendment protections and calls on the courts to look more carefully at the claims that incarcerated folks are making with respect to their ability to practice their religions. And I think we're still in a period where the consequences of this legislation are being worked out. I think that the landscape continues to be dynamic, and while I don't think we'll return to the era of the 1960s where religious freedom becomes a central means of collective organizing, to transform the world and transform prisons, it does seem like we're entering an era where more incarcerated folks will be seeing religious liberty as a means to contest unjust prison practices of all sorts, and to create spaces for collective imagining.
So from that, do I take it that you have kind of like a optimistic or kind of hopeful approach in terms of how faith, how kind of belief, and or kind of like questions of religious liberty can serve liberatory ends?
Yes, I mean, I think we're in a really interesting moment where the issues and ideologies are being scrambled, right? Where people are making, outside of this prison context, people are making religious liberty arguments around immigration and abortion and all sorts of issues, right? In the prison context, people are making religious liberty arguments around rights to marry, or for conjugal visits, or for to touch each other, to make phone calls, right? There's a quite wide scope that right, a capaciousness to what religious liberty can involve, which is really promising, and and it seems hopeful, in part because it doesn't cut evenly around really entrenched ideological divides. But I mean, beyond all of that, I think one of the really striking things for me in sort of thinking around and working around prison abolition movements is that I think we're at a point where so prison abolition is now part of mainstream political conversations, which is a good thing. And there's a kind of prison reform versus prison abolition debate that gets framed, which seems much better than the build more prisons versus build even more prisons debate that we were having, not so long ago, even just 15 or 20 years ago. So that shift seems promising. But I think at an elite level, that at least as I found it, the nonprofits and funders are still quite tone deaf to religion when it comes to prisons, and just don't see how these two things could be related. But when, at least when I've been talking to grassroots organizers across the U.S., right, working on prison abolition, religious stuff is deeply motivating, right? Whether it's a conversion experience, whether it's a way of imagining, whether it's a liturgy or ritual that's involved in their organizing practice, whether it's a form of community building that they draw from religious traditions. And I think that gives me hope, right? That this greatest form of religious imagination, right, in its collective sense, in its way of organizing people when the state and the powers that be want to separate people, when that form of religious imagination is so evident in these grassroots abolition efforts that are not just imagining a world without prisons, but putting into practice what it looks like to find alternative forms of justice, to experiment with restorative and transformative justice, to attack, right, the local efforts to expand prisons, even when it seems like an impossible fight, even when it seems like a hopeless fight. That seems like religion at its best, right, when it's making what seems impossible possible.
I find hope. I mean, this conversation is really inspiring, and I find hope in kind of in a way that you were saying, the ways in which like regular everyday people can find opportunities to open up some of those doors and open up some of those opportunities, particularly those that point towards greater freedom and liberty, that were sort of like pushed wide open during that era prior to the sort of like period of declension. And that those possibilities, I think as you were sort of saying, I think we're seeing more of them in this day and time. And those are the kinds of developments, the ones that you were sort of speaking to, particularly within the religious context. Those are the kinds of things that bring me hope.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and I'm sure everyone listening has learned so much. Thank you for watching.
No, thank you.